Hello and welcome to the first review of Request Month 2023. This is Powerslave, also known as Exhumed in Europe and 1999 AD Resurrection of the Pharaoh in Japan. Although most of what you're going to be seeing throughout this video is of the enhanced port remaster thing that Night Vibe did that was called Powerslave Exhumed. The original game was released on the Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and MS-DOS, but the remaster is available on PC, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, and Nintendo Switch. And what you're going to be seeing throughout this video is the PC version when it comes to Powerslave Exhumed, and as far as the original game goes, I will have some footage of the DOS version running in the Build GDX source port for when I talk about the differences between the console versions and the DOS version. This is a first-person shooter originally developed by Lobotomy Software and published by Playmates Interactive, first for the Sega Saturn back in 1996, with the DOS version following soon after, and the PlayStation version would follow in 1997. And it's a pretty interesting game because it is a very early attempt at combining a first-person shooter with Metroidvania elements. I say very early because it was so early that the entire Metroidvania genre really wasn't a thing yet. In fact, at that time, you can really say it was more combining Metroid elements because Castlevania Symphony of the Night, the game that changed the genre conception into Metroidvania, was actually released a few months after the original release of Powerslave. In fact, it was released the same month as the PlayStation version of Powerslave. And so I have to wonder if Powerslave actually inspired Metroid Prime at all, because remember, Metroid Prime came out in 2002, and a lot of people seem to think that that was basically the first-person Metroidvania when it clearly was not. Now that said, Powerslave is more first-person shooter than it is Metroidvania, and that's especially true with the PC version, because the PC version plays more like a traditional first-person shooter. It has actual level structure, and the game behaves more like what you would expect from a typical build-engine first-person shooter, which it is a build-engine first-person shooter on PC. On the console versions, it ran in a proprietary engine that was developed by Lobotomy Software. They both use the same art assets, however, so they're going to look pretty much the same regardless of which version you're playing, but with some slight differences. But that's something I'll talk about a bit more when I start talking about the presentation. As for the games themselves, however, they originally released back in 1996 and 97, and they got a very mixed reception at the time, which really isn't surprising. A lot of these games that were trying to innovate and in fact were quite ambitious like this didn't necessarily go over all that well. Now, there are plenty of justifiable reasons for that, especially in cases where the games were incredibly buggy or they ran poorly or whatever the case may be, but sometimes it was just audiences at the time not necessarily understanding what the game was going for, and in hindsight, the game actually turns out to be a hidden gem. So what's the case with Powerslave? Well, it was the only original game developed by Lobotomy Software. They did go on to make ports of Quake and Duke Nukem 3D for the Sega Saturn, but after that they went defunct. And given how unsuccessful the Sega Saturn was in the West, that's really not all that surprising. It's also a bit of a shame because the Sega Saturn actually has a lot of really cool games on it, a lot of which didn't make it over to the West, but that's a subject for a different video. Powerslave itself went on to have a cult following, and it was finally re-released in the DOS version on GOG back in 2020, with the remastered enhanced port by Night Dive, Powerslave Exhumed, following in 2022. This new version not only brought the game to modern systems, but it was also an attempt to combine elements of the PlayStation, Saturn, and PC versions in an attempt to make it a sort of definitive edition of Powerslave, because there are some pretty wild differences between the console versions and the DOS version, but there are less differences between the Saturn and PlayStation versions. Now, I don't have the console versions and never did, because I simply didn't have a PlayStation 1 or a Sega Saturn back in the day and didn't acquire them until rather recently, but I also didn't have the PC version until fairly recently. When it released on GOG, I went ahead and picked it up almost immediately, but back when it originally released, I just didn't really have access to it. I don't remember seeing it on any store shelves at the time, and frankly, at the time, I was far more concerned with other games out there. Namely, some very big-name titles like, say, Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior and Quake. So this is one of those instances where nostalgia is just not going to play a role in my assessment of the game at all. I'm really more concerned with what it does as a first-person shooter and how it incorporates the Metroidvania elements or at least Metroid elements at the time, and whether or not that makes for a compelling experience. So let's just go ahead and get things started. And as usual, we're going to go ahead and start with presentation, which, like I said, in the PC version runs on the build engine, but the console versions run in a proprietary engine developed by Lobotomy Software. Regardless of engine, however, they both use mostly the same art assets. There are a few slight differences between versions, but they are fairly slight. Things like adjusting certain sprites' size, or changing the color palette a bit in the DOS version compared to the console versions. But most of the changes are really more in the gameplay department than in the visuals or sounds, so that's something I'll talk about a bit more later. As far as the art assets themselves go, however, you are dealing with 2D sprites in 3D environments, and while this doesn't really result in any weirdness with the way Powerslave Exhumed looks, you do notice some oddities with the way things are rendered in the build engine version of the game. It's certainly nothing game-breaking or anything, but it is something you might notice occasionally once you slow down and really start to take in the visuals. If you're actually just playing the game normally, you're probably not going to notice it all that much. Regardless, it's not that big of a deal, and the sprites themselves are all very nice, classic 90s pixel art that looks quite good. Apart from some of the more modern tech like the M60 or the Revolver or things like that, pretty much everything bears some very heavy ancient Egyptian influences, and it gives the game a pretty unique look. It also just looks quite good. It's very well done pixel art that's animated quite well. And while it's not really all that impressive from a technical standpoint, the visuals still hold up quite well all these years later, and you get a very pleasingly retro aesthetic as a result. The sound design, on the other hand, doesn't hold up quite as well. It does have some audio mixing problems, particularly with regards to the original DOS version, but even Powerslave Exhumed has a few issues here and there. They've done a better job with the audio mixing in Powerslave Exhumed, but the voice of Ramses is still a bit muted and quiet compared to some of the other sound in the game, and the gun and explosion effects and such don't have quite the impact that I'd really like to hear from them. And while you can certainly change the music and sound volume to try to fix some of the mixing issues that are present, the music balancing is loud enough to where you actually have to turn that volume down quite a lot more than you may be used to for trying to balance out the audio in other games. It's certainly not a major problem or anything, but they definitely could have done a better job with the audio mixing. As for the music, it's pretty decent quality, it's just that the same tracks end up getting repeated quite often, so it does end up getting pretty repetitive. It's music that has some nice action to it, and it bears some very heavy ancient Egyptian adventure stylings to it, so it feels very appropriate for what you're doing. It's just that, like I said, when you're playing through a few levels back to back and you end up running into the same song over and over again during them, they just end up losing their luster. Then of course there's the voice acting, which consists of narration and King Ramses talking to you and giving you some insight on the items you're picking up and where you might need to go next. Now on the one hand, they did get Don LaFontaine, the classic movie trailer guy, to do the narration of the game, and that's cool. But then Ramses starts talking, and because the audio mixing is just a bit off and there's no subtitles, sometimes you sit there and wonder what he's actually saying.
A great palace that has been swallowed by the sea awaits you on the other side. Waste no time, for my soul is growing weaker as the killbot continue to draw energy from my corpse.
And unfortunately, at least in the console versions, he's the only real voice you're gonna have throughout the entire game. In the console versions and Powerslave Exhumed, the protagonist does a bunch of grunting and screaming and such, but it's not really unless you play the PC version that you actually hear him talking, and while they did try to do the typical build engine thing of having the protagonist make a bunch of snarky comments whenever he blasts enemies apart, the protagonist of Powerslave just doesn't have anything witty or amusing to say. So it's pretty easy to see why they left that out of Powerslave Exhumed. It just doesn't add anything to the game. But while there are certainly a few blemishes on the audio side of things, when you bring all of the presentation together, it all generally holds up pretty well. And the strong ancient Egyptian aesthetics really carry a lot of that presentation. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as a Special Forces soldier who is sent into the ancient Egyptian city of Karnak because the city has been taken over by strange alien forces that you later find out are called the Killmot, who are trying to harness the power of the ancient pharaoh King Ramses in order to rule the world. And you're the one lone badass who can stop them from doing that. Look, it was the 90s. Storylines and first-person shooters were not a major focus. It was really all on the gameplay, and that is painfully obvious with the story of Powerslave. It is an incredibly stupid, ridiculous plotline that you can barely even follow as you play the game, because nothing you're doing really has any effect on the plot, and the only plot you're really getting is some really weak and often barely audible exposition dumps from King Ramses in between getting artifacts and moving to different areas. Now, despite the game's complete inability to make the player really care much about the storyline of the game, it does have multiple endings, and that is true in both the console and, of course, Powerslave Exhumed and PC versions of the game, where in the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions, you have to collect all of the pieces of a radio transmitter in order to get the good ending, and if you don't collect all of them, you get the bad ending. And in the PC version, you have to disarm the Killmot's Doomsday weapon, and if you fail to do that within the allotted time limit, then you get the bad ending, whereas if you do succeed at it, you get the good ending. Although, with how weak the endings are in the PC version in general, it's almost like the endings were a complete afterthought. In fact, it's almost like the ending of the game was a complete afterthought. And that's both from a writing and a gameplay perspective. So that, of course, brings me to talking about the gameplay in general, which is what really matters for Powerslave, or Exhumed, or 1999 AD Resurrection of the Pharaoh, or of course Powerslave Exhumed, depending on which version of the game you're playing. So let's start by talking about the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions of the game, since they're the most similar. The idea there is that they're a combination of first-person shooter and, at that time, Metroid-style mechanics, where you gradually get new movement capabilities and such as you go through the game, and that allows you to explore previously inaccessible areas. So to give you some examples there, you'll eventually get an artifact that allows you to jump very far distances. This allows you to jump across chasms that you couldn't normally jump across before. You'll eventually get something that allows you to breathe underwater for a long period of time, allowing you to access underwater areas. You'll also eventually gain the ability to walk through force fields, as well as walk on lava and poison swamps, allowing you to get to areas that you couldn't get to before. And as the game progresses, you'll be combining these various abilities in numerous jumping puzzles and such like that in order to access, of course, the various pieces of the radio transmitter, as well as access all of the keys and such that you'll need to get through the level and get to the next area. This means that a lot of your time spent playing the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions is going to be spent backtracking, going through areas that you've been through before in order to get to the new areas that you couldn't access previously. And you find very quickly that once you go back through an area that you've already been through, all of the enemies have respawned and you have to recollect all of the keys in order to get through the level again. Now, that's a fairly normal thing as far as Metroidvanias go. I mean, if you play, say, a Castlevania game like Symphony of the Night or one of the Metroid games, whenever you go back through an area you've already been to, the enemies have respawned. That's not usually a big deal in a platformer, although it can get a bit tedious after a while. In a first-person shooter, on the other hand, where you're often forced to fight all of the enemies to get through an area, it can be fairly annoying. Because every single fight in every single first-person shooter drains your resources, namely your health and your ammunition. In the case of Powerslave on consoles and Powerslave Exhumed, this is in the form of weapon power. Every single weapon except for the machete that you start with, which is your basic melee weapon, has a weapon power meter that will go down as you continue to use it. You can replenish this meter by picking up the various weapon power orbs that will spawn from enemies and certain destructibles in the environment, as well as the considerably more rare full weapon power orbs that you can find scattered in some of the levels. But this has a bit of a caveat. You see, in most first-person shooters, you would go and find various ammunition for the different weapons that you're using. So, say the M60 would have its own ammunition, the revolver would have its own ammunition, the staff would have its own ammunition, so on and so forth. Weapon power pickups, on the other hand, simply get applied to whatever weapon you currently have equipped. This means that if you're not using the weapon that you need to replenish the ammunition on the most, then you're probably going to waste a weapon power pickup when you come across it. The full weapon power pickup, on the other hand, applies the full weapon meter to all of the weapons that you currently have access to. While the full weapon power pickups are simply scattered in the levels, the various weapon power and, of course, health pickups are somewhat random since they're dropped by enemies and those destructibles in the environment. So you might end up with a whole bunch of health pickups that you can't use, and no weapon power pickups, but limited ammunition, or you might have plenty of weapon power, but not all that many health pickups. Now, most of the time, this isn't that big of a deal. You usually have plenty of weapon power to deal with whatever things are thrown at you, and you usually have enough health pickups to mitigate the damage that you're taking, at least on the normal difficulty setting anyway. But it's still a rather clunky system that, frankly, the DOS version handles a lot better. But I'll talk about that more in a moment. Aside from the somewhat awkward way of handling health and ammo pickups in the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions, there's also a considerably more frustrating element to the combat, that being the player's hitbox, which is unusually wide, so much so that even though it looks like you've dodged numerous attacks, they still hit you. This means that when you're going through a corridor and an enemy is throwing a projectile at you, there's not really a way of dodging it until you gain access to the ability that lets you jump really high. And even then, that's only useful in areas where you do have the vertical space to be able to jump over an attack. In areas where that's simply not going to work, well, you're just not going to be able to avoid taking the hit, and you better hope you have enough health to deal with it. Much like with the weapon power situation, at least if you're playing on the normal difficulty, this isn't necessarily that big of a deal, because you usually can find enough health pickups to compensate for any damage that you're taking. It is still annoying, however, to not be able to avoid taking damage in what is ostensibly an old-school first-person shooter, or really more something along the lines of Metroid, because even in games like Metroid and Castlevania and all that, you're given considerably more of an opportunity to be able to avoid getting hit in the first place. But while this hitbox is certainly annoying enough in the combat side of things, it's even more frustrating when it comes time to do things like platforming, because you'll try to jump through areas that you think you would be able to fit through, but because your hitbox is too wide, you simply can't. And in quite a lot of levels, when you're trying to do a jumping puzzle, it's over an instant death lava pit or something along those lines, so when you go and do a jump, you just end up falling to your death and having to start back over at the checkpoint. This brings me to ultimately the fatal flaw of Powerslave, the one thing that makes it frustrating more than actually enjoyable: the checkpoint system. Most people these days probably don't even think about checkpoint systems because they're just so used to them, and they're so used to the checkpoints being frequent and quite forgiving. Back when Powerslave released, on the other hand, checkpoints really weren't all that common, and they certainly weren't forgiving. If you had a checkpoint system in a game, you were lucky if it was a checkpoint system where it saved at the very beginning of a level, and then whenever you died, you would have to start the entire level over. Powerslave isn't quite that unforgiving. It does have checkpoints in the middle of levels. The problem is that there are very few of these checkpoints within the levels, and after you activate a checkpoint, it only saves your progress up to the point where that checkpoint was activated. That makes sense, except that it's not actually saving your game. It's only retaining your progress up to the point where you activated the checkpoint. If you want to save any additional progress you make after that, you have to find a different checkpoint. And this only works while you're still playing that one level. It only actually saves your progress once you've finished that level and moved to a different area, which in turn means that you've moved back to the world map in the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions. If you get to a checkpoint and then decide, say, to take a break, go get some lunch or something like that, and then you quit out of the game and try to go back to it later, you'll find that you've lost all of the progress you've made within that level, and you have to start it all over again. This is annoying enough when it's early on in the game and the levels themselves are fairly easy and fairly short. It gets considerably more irritating when you get later on in the game, the levels get longer and more complicated and more frustrating to deal with, and you're having to repeat numerous sections over and over and over again because there are so many instant death traps. And even beyond simple instant death traps, you just have to deal with the incredibly clunky platforming system in general. Jumping is kind of hard to describe, actually. When you do the basic jump at the very beginning of the game, before you gain access to the item that extends your jump, you just do a quick hop, and it has basically no range to it whatsoever, both vertical and horizontal. When you get the item that allows you to extend your jump, what you have to do with that is actually press and hold the jump button in order to gain the additional height. Then you eventually gain access to an item that allows you to levitate by jumping and then releasing the button and pressing it again in rapid succession in order to just glide for a bit. And some of the jumps you have to make are actually quite precise. You have to get to a specific height and then glide the rest of the way, and if you mess it up at all, you fall into an instant death pit, or you fall down to basically the beginning of the level, or any number of things like that are all incredibly frustrating. And between the rather clunky way they've handled the jumping controls in this regard, and more importantly, the really weird jumping physics that you never really get used to, it just makes the first-person platforming incredibly annoying to deal with. First-person platforming has always been extremely rocky. Most games don't handle it well, and back in the 90s in particular, whenever there were platforming sections in first-person shooters, people generally tended to groan because they knew it was going to be awful. And unfortunately, Powerslave is really no exception in that regard. The jumping in it is just a mess, and it gets incredibly frustrating to deal with the further you get into the game. And that's really how I would describe Powerslave in general. It's not that it's necessarily an outright bad game, it's that it's just clunky enough, just early enough in the melding of Metroid-style mechanics with first-person shooter mechanics that it's obvious they didn't really know how to pull it off, and the end result is something that ends up being more frustrating than it is enjoyable, even though it has some neat ideas in it, and even though the aesthetics really do carry the experience a fair bit. It's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts scenario. You start out the game and you're fighting enemies that are just boring to deal with, and you think to yourself, okay, well, it'll definitely get better. Then you get more weapons, and you encounter more advanced enemies, and the combat gets better at least. Well, until you realize that the best solution for pretty much any scenario is apply M60, and that just makes the combat kind of boring. And then as far as the puzzle solving and platforming goes, well, the platforming starts out crap and it never gets any better, and the puzzle solving side of things is never really complicated enough to be interesting, and it just ends up being kind of tedious. All the while you're being worn down by the constant backtracking and the checkpoint system being frustrating to deal with, and eventually, you're almost certainly going to end up in one of two situations. Either you're just finishing the game out of either obligation or spite, just feeling like you have to finish the game because otherwise the game is beating you, or you're just going to say, you know what, I don't really feel like finishing this anymore, and you just end up putting the game aside. Maybe you come back to it later, probably you don't though. And to make matters worse, your experience is going to differ fairly wildly depending on which version of the game you're playing. If you're playing the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions, the experience is like I've already described. But if you decide to pick up the PC version, then it's basically an entirely different game using the same assets. I mean, it runs on the build engine, which already has its own quirks and weirdness, but it also has entirely different level design. It's a linear game as opposed to one where you have to backtrack through previous areas to get the things that you didn't get before. And while it does still have some puzzle solving and platforming sections like you would expect after having played the console or Powerslave Exhumed versions, it also has a very different feel to its combat because it plays a lot more like a more standard build engine first-person shooter. By that I mean things like the various weapons have their own individual ammo counters, so the M60 has its own ammunition, the revolver has its own ammunition, so on and so forth. And much like with, say, Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior, where in those games the pistol would have to reload after 12 shots and the Uzis would have to reload after 50 shots each, in the case of, say, the revolver and the M60, they have to automatically reload after a certain number of shots as well. Enemies behave differently than they did in the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions. To give you a prime example, when you go up against the mummies in the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions, they just shoot projectiles at at you, and you shoot at them, and they eventually fall over. In the DOS version, on the other hand, they shoot two different types of projectiles at you, and if you get hit with the red one, it turns you into a mummy and gives you a staff weapon that will annihilate anything that is in the room with you with a single attack before turning you back into your normal self. And of course, there are other weapons that are carried over between the games that just behave a bit differently, like say with the M60 and the revolver with their ammunition situation. But they also did things like tweak the Bracelet of Power to, instead of just shooting lightning bolts like it does in the console versions, it generates a lightning cloud above enemies that just continually strikes them with powerful lightning, meaning that it's very useful for enemies that move around an awful lot. There's also the addition of an item system, much like you would see in other build engine games, where you can just find a bunch of items like, say, torches and such scattered around the levels, and they can be activated to have a limited time effect. For example, you can find torches scattered around the levels that will allow you to light up dark areas. They also changed the health system a bit. In the console and Powerslave Exhumed versions, you can find some items that will increase your maximum health. This basically gives you additional health bars. In the DOS version, on the other hand, you have a lives system, so you'll find extra lives scattered around the maps, and then those will allow you to respawn at the last checkpoint. That's right, I said checkpoint because the DOS version also has the same checkpoint system, except that it doesn't have the backtracking mechanic associated with it. Yeah, it was a bit odd regardless of which version you were playing, although I will say that the DOS version has the added benefit of, if you're playing the Build GDX source port, it includes the ability to save anywhere you want instead of just using checkpoint saves. I'm sure purists will say that's not the way the game is meant to be played and will demand that you play it with checkpoints, but you know what? I did play it the way it was meant to be played, with the checkpoint system, and you know what? I wished I would have had the save anywhere option enabled instead. It would have made the game considerably more tolerable. I say tolerable because even with the save anywhere feature, Powerslave DOS is just not very good. The combat is arguably better than the console versions, but that's not really saying much. The combat in the console versions and Powerslave Exhumed is just not all that great. Don't get me wrong, it's not terrible or anything, it's a perfectly serviceable combat system, but it never really elevates beyond that. It's not anywhere near as good as titans of the era like, say, Duke 3D, Shadow Warrior, Blood, Quake, all that sort of thing. But it's also not really trying to be either. It's trying to be this weird hybrid of an old-school first-person shooter and a Metroid-style game, and it's just painfully obvious that because this was one of the earliest games to really try to do something like that, they just didn't really know what they were doing with it, and neither of those approaches meshed all that well in Powerslave. The end result here is that regardless of whether you're playing the original console versions or Powerslave Exhumed or the DOS version, Powerslave is not the kind of game that has aged like fine wine. It's not something you can just pick up and play and enjoy right off the bat like you can with some of those other old-school first-person shooters, like, say, ones that I've already been talking about. Doom, Quake, Shadow Warrior, Duke 3D, etc. Those are games that are effectively timeless classics. Powerslave is definitely a classic, but it's the kind of classic that's more of a historical curiosity than anything else. It's the kind of thing that folks like myself find really interesting, even if we don't necessarily enjoy it as a game. But when it comes to actually recommending whether or not you should pick it up and give it a try yourself, well, that's another story entirely. I have a really hard time recommending this to anyone that isn't just interested in the relatively early development of the first-person shooter genre. You have to be willing to forgive quite a lot to actually be able to enjoy Powerslave as a game. And as such, I really just can't recommend it to a general audience. If you're a fan of boomer shooters, as they call them these days, then, well, you might be able to get something out of it, but you're going to have to get past, in particular, that awful checkpoint system and the awful platforming. And with how prevalent those are in the game, that's a pretty tough sell. But for those of you who are willing to put up with all of that, I'll have links in the video description box to where you can pick up the game yourself. Thank you all very much for watching, and thanks for bearing with me over the past several weeks when it comes to things like video production, because it's been kind of a roller coaster of all kinds of weird things happening. I had all of those issues that I previously described in that video I did on Watch Dogs and the quick channel update, But with Powerslave in particular, I had all manner of weird recording problems. For some baffling reason, it would just not record the gameplay footage when I was actually trying to record it. I ended up with only about 28 minutes of usable footage at one point, after having played the game for several hours and been recording that entire time. It was only recording the game audio, and I have no idea why. Because the recording process I was using was Shadowplay, and it was working perfectly with all manner of other games, whether it be things like Cyberpunk 2077, or Halo Infinite, or hell, I even got it working with Betrayal in Antara, and that's a direct draw game from the 90s. Meanwhile, with Powerslave Exhumed, it just stopped recording after a while, and I didn't know why, and it wouldn't record the Build GDX version at all, even though it records other Build GDX games just fine. I got no idea what was happening there, but obviously we got around that. I had to use a different recording method, but it did work even though it's a bit jankier, so we got through it. Now at the time I'm recording this, I haven't finished any of the other Requests Month videos, so hopefully those don't turn out to have technical problems either, but we'll just have to wait and see. If there are any, I'll let you know in the closing portion of the video like I'm doing right now, but we'll just get there when we get there. As far as the Q&A goes, if you have any questions for the Q&A video that I'll be doing at the beginning of April, go ahead and submit those. You can either send them directly to me via direct message on Patreon, or just put them in the comments section of really any of my videos. As long as I get the notifications for them, then it shouldn't be a problem. And I've also made a community post where you can submit the questions there if you think it's easier to do it that way, so you've got multiple ways of submitting Q&A questions if you have them, so feel free to ask those. But otherwise, thank you all again for watching. Thanks for bearing with me during all the weird issues and such. Thanks for bearing with me during this rambly bit here at the end of the video. And I'll see you all in later videos.